Hi, I'm Elaine Holden. Welcome to Education Matters here on Channel 96, Nashua, New Hampshire. You know, when I started this show, I started thinking about all the different and important things that really need to be discussed with parents, grandparents, caregivers, teachers, school administrators, regarding children, childhood development, and all the areas that we have to kind of watch out for so that children can grow and really develop as well and as happily as expected, do as well in school, and grow to be very happy and productive adults and have as good a life as possible. And so I kind of select a wide variety of topics that I can discuss once every week so that people can become more informed about how we can help our children grow and develop the best way possible. So this week I'm talking about otitis media. And I've got my shell here, and I'm going to put my shell right here next to my ear, because it's all about hearing. Otitis media is really a fancy word for ear infections. That's all it means. And we have two types of otitis media. We have acute episodes and we have chronic episodes. Now, we all know what an acute episode of ear infections looks like. The face of the child is red. They've probably got their hand on their ear. There's a temperature, they're crying, and I swear it's usually at 2 o'clock in the morning. We've all been there, right? And as adults, we can probably remember having at least one ear infection. They're pretty common. Common enough that it is the most common cause for a visit to an emergency ward or to the pediatrician. Ear infections are very, very common. So it's not the acute episode that I'm going to be talking about. It's the chronic episode. What does that mean? Well, there's really no symptoms. There's no fever. There's no redness of the face. The child isn't in distress physically as the child would be when he or she is experiencing an acute episode. Rather, it's an ear infection that's kind of percolating in the inner ear. Now, if you remember your biology class from high school, you probably had a biology teacher that held up sort of a plastic model of the ear and said, here's your tympanic membrane, your eardrum, and the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrups, those three little bones, and the sound comes in and vibrates the eardrum, and the eardrum vibrates those three bones, and all this vibration goes into the cochlea, and eventually it gets into the brain, and the brain interprets what those vibrations are, and that's how sound gets in. That's how music gets in. That's how ambient sound, birds singing and horns honking and people talking. And so that's really what is the important piece here, people talking. But what happens with an acute episode of ear infections, chronic otitis media, with this effusion, this liquid that's in the ears? Because what happens is when you are percolating something in the inner ear, fluid builds up. The hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, and the eardrum all depend on enough air around this entire apparatus to be able to vibrate, to handle those vibrations of sound. But the effusion, the liquid in there, impedes that. It stops it so that the sound really doesn't get in. And so when we have a chronic episode, what we have is a child that's probably had an acute episode, which means with the red face and the temperature and the whole thing, and then they get antibiotics and it goes down. And so the temperature goes down to normal and the redness of the face goes away and the child appears to be getting better. But what happens is that effusion, that liquid, can remain after the antibiotics are done. And it can remain sometimes 2-3 months even, we have seen. So what does that say? Well, it means that there are periods of time between these acute episodes when there is a chronic condition that would be called chronic otitis media with effusion, meaning that that liquid is still in the inner ear and impeding the sound. And when that sound is stopped, when it is impeded, when the child isn't hearing the sounds correctly, that child is not able to map those sounds correctly. And if there's no memory of those sounds, if there's no recognition of those sounds, if they don't have the ability to develop that understanding, it really means that they don't have the foundation skill of manipulating sounds, phonemes of the language, which serves as the real foundation for learning how to read. So, what happens? Well, unfortunately, these children are now in a situation where they walk into school and they probably have language. And I understand that many people will say, well, you know, they'll catch up. After they've had those ear infections, even if they're chronic, they will catch up with language. And I am not disputing that. They will acquire language. You will see some vestiges of difficulty. For example, if you hear somebody say, could you be more specific about that? We know the word is specific, but they didn't hear the s when they were developing language, when they were getting to really get good at language, and Pacific may be a hangover from when they had those ear infections as little kids. Be that as it may, when you have children who have not had access to sound, it's as if they were hearing impaired or deaf. We know that as a population, the deaf and hearing impaired have the lowest reading scores of any group. And that's because they have had to use sight in order to learn to read. Now, 50 years ago, when teachers started to be taught how to teach reading and the most up-to-date reading research, etc., the professors frequently said, look, if their auditory modality isn't working, just use the visual. Have them memorize the words. It'll work. Don't worry about it. Well, we know that isn't true anymore. We know that doesn't work. We know the research says, that's not how it is. Because we have not only the research of the children who have had chronic otitis media with effusion and have not learned how to read, we also have the research on the deaf and hearing impaired population who have only been taught visually. And in both instances, they're not very good readers. And so with that evidence, with that information, we can then in turn say, children need to have those sounds. They need the 45 phonemes of language. And so one of the things that parents and grandparents, caregivers have to acknowledge is that children who have had chronic ear infections are at high risk for reading challenges, reading failure. Right now, here in New Hampshire, we have approximately 11% of our school population, kindergarten through grade 12, who suffer from the after effects of chronic otitis media with effusion. Those after effects mean they need extra help in speech, they need extra help in reading, they need extra help in probably processing language. What does that mean for you and me as taxpayers? It comes to probably over $30 million a year. That's just for our state, just New Hampshire. Imagine all those other states out there. That's a lot of money that people have to pay in taxes to accommodate, to intervene, to add educationally a lot of help to those children who have experienced ear infection, sometimes from as young as 6 weeks of age. Now, we will also have to acknowledge that ear infections genetically, the predisposition to ear infections, genetically somehow, on occasion, link up with dyslexia. Yeah, dyslexia may be one of the manifestations of an impaired immune system. So a child who may have an impaired immune system may be dyslexic, somehow or other they're hooked together genetically. And so what does that say? Well, it says that maybe the immune system isn't strong enough to fight off those infections. And for many pediatricians, that is a red flag. It means that we have to look very closely at these children. We have to pay very close attention to their language development, how they're handling the various sounds of the language. There are specific tests that let us track these children and their language development. If they don't get it naturally, they have to have early intervention, because that early intervention helps them along that developmental continuum. There's a lot of research out there from places like Alexander Graham Bell Labs. There's a program called the SMILE program. It's a multisensory reading program, and it is designed specifically for children with hearing impairment and deafness. And what does it do? It focuses on the 45 phonemes. Now, there's a lot of different ways that we teach reading, but I will tell you that when we use that SMILE program to help deaf and hearing impaired children, we're actually working with multisensory techniques, including helping them map those 45 sounds. It's auditory intervention. We use what's called oral motor cueing, the position of the mouth, the vibration of the throat. There's a lot that goes into it, but it's worth it. Because when these children have that program and have really good access to the sounds and develop that auditory modality, even though they're deaf and hearing impaired, it can be done because they're using devices such as hearing aids and sometimes cochlear implants. When this happens, their reading scores shoot way up. So we know that this access to sound makes a huge difference for that population, and it makes a huge difference for the population of children that suffer from the after effects of chronic otitis media with a fusion. So yeah, if you have a child or a grandchild, or you know a child who has chronic ear infections, a child who struggles to understand what is being said. Sometimes you watch the children and they're so close to the television. They've got the sound way up and they're watching the mouth movements in the television. They're trying to get as much attention as possible, focused on what's happening on the TV. And as I said, they're very close to it. That's frequently a signal that they're not hearing as well as they should. We have a lot of hearing tests for children, and we in New Hampshire are blessed to have really good early hearing, okay, newborn screening. New Hampshire is probably one of the better states in the union for this. We recognize the importance of children and the ability to hear as being critical to childhood development. Some states aren't as lucky as New Hampshire, but we really have good interventions and good incentives. Bottom line is that most children are screened early on for hearing ability, and that's wonderful. We know that some children will lose their hearing after they have been screened as newborns and before the age of 2.5. We really don't know why this happens, and it's a small percentage of population when you balance it out with all the kids in the state, in the country. But it's still the most common birth difference. Hearing loss is still the most common birth difference. So we have children who have hearing loss at birth. We have children who for some reason or another, and we're not sure why, sometimes because they've had antibiotics to fight a horrible infection such as meningitis. Sometimes meningitis causes hearing loss. Sometimes the antibiotics given to fight the meningitis causes hearing loss. There are other reasons, so many that we really don't know all of them. But we know there's a percentage of population that does have hearing loss. And pediatricians and nurse practitioners are very vigilant about this. Teachers and school nurses are very vigilant about hearing loss. But we still have to do the intervention. And there's a sort of a scale, mild to moderate, moderate and moderate to severe. And teachers many times see the definition of mild hearing loss or mild to moderate, and it's like, oh, that's no big deal, right? Because educationally, when we see mild to moderate, we're not as worried as if we see profound or severe, right? So we think very little of that terminology. But when we're looking at mild to moderate with respect to hearing loss, it really has to do with an impact on speech, because mild to moderate hearing loss is a medical definition. When you translate mild to moderate hearing loss medically into the education field, it's holy smoke, we really have to do something. So don't let the mild to moderate hearing loss soothe you. The reality is that we really do need to do intervention when it is mild to moderate. Obviously, when it's also moderate to severe to profound. In any case, any hearing loss makes a difference. And children who have had chronic otitis media have had hearing loss. They have not heard the language, they have not heard the sounds, the phonemes, and these children need intervention. So schools need to know if a child has had a series of ear infections. Now, there are times children have had episodes, the acute episodes, and it has come on them so fast that they've actually ruptured an eardrum, or both. In those cases, what happens, the eardrum does repair itself, but scar tissue can occur. And I remember in the beginning of the show, I said that eardrum has to move and fluctuate. Scar tissue doesn't move and fluctuate so well. So if that scar tissue isn't moving and fluctuating, it means that the sounds are not getting in as easily. So that's another issue. The child may actually have hearing loss as a result of chronic ear infections. And that has to be dealt with as well. Children who have experienced hearing loss because of ear infections and the ruptured eardrum, repeated ruptured eardrum, will need help. They will need assistance. And remember I said that if you have ear infections, there's some research that says the child may actually have an impaired immune system. That's the first red flag. Well, let's think about it. If you see an impaired immune system genetically linked to dyslexia, and the child already will most likely struggle with being able to process those phonemes, it just makes it worse to have had those ear infections. It exacerbates an underlying condition. So these are the things that parents have to pay very close attention to. One of the things that I always tell parents is to make sure that teachers understand that if the child has had ear infections, that they know about it, and that the special ed department knows about it, and that there are interventions in place. Earlier, the better. If you get brushed off about this, or you're told they seem to be fine, or don't worry about it, those ear infections are all done now, they're older. The aftermath of the ear infections is what I'm talking about as being also of concern educationally. Remember I said 11% of the population suffers from the after effects, the post-otitis media problem, again, back to $30 million and more every year to help these children. The further they go in school without getting the necessary intervention at the level of intervention they require in order to make progress, means that down the line it's going to cost us more money, because these children may start acting out. They may be frustrated because they have not developed the hearing and the auditory processing that is necessary to be able to attend in the classroom. Now, there's a lot of reasons children don't attend in classrooms, but what concerns me is that if a child is labeled as having an attentional problem, there's a 48% chance that that child actually has auditory processing deficit instead. So when you have a child labeled as attention deficit disorder, we know from research done right here in the state, right at Dartmouth Hitchcock, okay, that that child has an auditory problem 48% of the time. So 48% of the time, children that are labeled as attention deficit disorder actually have auditory processing deficit. And those ear infections, those episodes of ear infections, of chronic otitis media with effusion, contribute to auditory processing deficit. So it's really important that children are looked at closely for auditory issues. It's really important that children are tested early and often to make sure that they are able to hear. You know, it's all well and good to give a child antibiotics to decrease the temperature, to deal with that acute infection. You don't want the eardrum to burst. You want to get that temperature down. You want to make that child feel better. But you also have to realize that that effusion can remain. And when it does, it really impedes hearing. And if those children don't hear the sounds, they're not going to develop those underlying skills for reading. You know, back 40 years ago, I was involved in a lot of research having to do with acquisition of specific sounds. We have 45 sounds in the language. And my team was doing this research specifically to determine when on that developmental continuum those sounds were acquired. And so we were working with a large number of children, and we tested them, and we were able to pinpoint the specific sounds that the children did not have. Then we went back into the medical records, and we were able to identify from the medical records, and we of course had permission from the parents, we were able to identify within a 3 or 4 week period when that child had ear infections. So we would map all of the points on that continuum of the sounds that were missing. And we then had, matching up very closely, had the opportunity to match up with the medical records. And sure enough, what did we have? We had almost a one-to-one correspondence. So our job was to look at where on the continuum that child acquired the sounds. But the secondary piece of research was for the children who didn't acquire the sounds and matching it up to those ear infections. It's pretty fascinating research. And of course, it's been replicated many times since, my team was doing it way back in the day. But the cool thing is for us is that we were able to establish enough information so that we could then let other people do more very, very detailed research. And that was helpful to understand that the acquisition of reading really is based on the acquisition of those sounds, starting from birth, going all the way to age 6. And that's the important piece that, for us anyway, means that we had information, even back then, that the sounds, the phonemes were essential for reading. And that's what I'm saying today. If you have a child who has a history of ear infections, that child needs to have as much intervention as necessary in order to be able to be successful in school, especially as a reader. And to be told many times that it's okay if your child has had ear infections because they will acquire language and they'll catch up, everything will be okay. I'm not denying that. I'm not denying the catching up of language. What I'm saying is that the acquisition of the sounds follows a certain pattern, an expectation that is pretty easily mapped. And when those pieces are missing because the child has not been able to hear, because of that effusion in the ear, it makes a big difference for reading. And so now I want you to be as aware as possible, because this is something that your child's school needs to understand. If they are not aware of this, you may have to educate them. And if they are aware of it and they say, well, everything's okay, they seem all right, I would strongly suggest making sure that they are being tracked very carefully. Because at the first grade level, we know by Christmas time, a child should be sounding out consonant, vowel, consonant words, okay, like k, at, d, og, okay? They should be able to do this, no matter what kind of reading program they're given. If they're not able to do this, and if they're not able to rhyme, like cat and hat and mat and sat, if they can't do that, if they can't blend, if I say p, it, and they cannot say the word as pit, if they can't hold those phonemes in what's called short-term auditory sequential memory, auditory being that big one, right? If they can't do that, then something is wrong. They should be able to come into first grade able to blend, able to rhyme, even able to take parts of words off. For example, say cowboy, and the child says cowboy, and then you say it without boy, and the child says cow. They should be able to do that. The manipulation of word parts and sounds or phonemes from words, say bold, say it without the b, old. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. They should be ready for this in first grade. If they are not, that means that they do not have the ability to manipulate those phonemes, those sounds. And 11% of the population who suffers from chronic otitis media with effusion. Remember, post-otitis media issues. 11% of our school population has this problem. And this is the population that needs to have that intervention, that needs to be recognized as a group of children that have to have early intervention, intense intervention, intervention that is going to make a difference for them as readers and learners. I'm going to be talking more about attentional issues in future weeks, and part of that will stem right back to those children who look attentional but really have auditory processing deficits. So I want you to stay tuned for those as well. But in the meantime, please get that information together, get that medical information together, and be prepared to provide it to your children's teachers. New school year is happening. We want them to have as good an experience as possible. And we, as parents and grandparents, are pretty obliged to help that process along. Thanks for joining me today. I was delighted to be with you, and I'll be with you again next week. Goodbye.